The rain in Ostend never really stopped that spring. It just changed its mind about how hard it wanted to fall. Inside a borrowed studio above a closed-down fish market, the air smelled like wet concrete, stale coffee, and the particular kind of cigarette smoke that builds up in a room where nobody opens the windows because somebody's always recording. Marvin Gaye sat on a stool with his coat still on, even though it was warm inside. He hadn't taken it off in 3 days. Larkin Arnold had flown in from New York with his patience already worn thin somewhere over the Atlantic. He was the head of black music at CBS Records, the man who had pulled Marvin out of a contract war with Motown and put him on Columbia's books for a fortune the label hadn't quite finished justifying internally. He had not flown across an ocean for small talk. He had flown across an ocean because for 6 weeks, nobody at CBS had heard a single finished song, and the silence had started to feel less like artistry and more like a man quietly falling apart on someone else's payroll. He stood in the doorway of the studio for a moment before anyone noticed him. Cables ran across the floor like roots. A drum machine sat half disassembled on a table, its wires spilling out like something that had been operated on and abandoned mid-surgery. And in the middle of it all, Marvin, who hadn't shaved, who hadn't really spoken to his own engineer in 2 days, according to what Larkin had been told over the phone. "You want to tell me what I'm paying for?" Larkin said. Not loud. He didn't need to be loud. Men like Larkin Arnold had learned a long time ago that the quiet voice does more damage in a room than the raised one. Marvin didn't answer right away. He looked at the drum machine like it owed him money. "I'm paying for silence, Marvin. 6 weeks of silence. Do you understand what silence costs in this business?" There's a version of this story where Marvin gets defensive, where he explains himself, where he tries to justify the weeks of nothing with talk of inspiration and process and timing. That's not what happened. What happened is that Marvin reached over, turned off the small lamp on the console so the only light in the room came from the gray window, and said almost nothing at all. "You came a long way to watch me work," he said. "So watch." To understand why that sentence carried the weight it did, you have to understand what had already been taken from this man. By the time he landed in Belgium, Marvin Gaye had buried a marriage, fled a country over a tax debt he couldn't pay, and walked away from the only record label he had ever known, the one that built him and then, in his eyes, started to own him instead of believe in him. Motown had rushed out an album he never finished the way he wanted, called it his vision, and let the public think that mess was his choice. He compared it later to someone else finishing a half-painted canvas and signing his name to it. That kind of wound doesn't heal in a hotel room. It festers in silence, in months of staring at gray water from an apartment window, in a man who stopped answering his own door because he wasn't sure anymore who he was supposed to be when somebody opened it. So when Larkin Arnold stood in that doorway demanding a return on his investment, he wasn't just talking to an artist behind schedule. He was talking to a man who had already lost everything once and had nothing left to lose twice. Larkin himself was no stranger to pressure. He had clawed his way up through a record industry that rarely made room for black executives at his level, and he hadn't done it by being soft. He had a reputation for walking into rooms and getting answers, for cutting through whatever excuse an artist was hiding behind that week. He believed in Marvin, that much was true, or he wouldn't have fought to bring him to Columbia in the first place. But belief has a shelf life in this business, and 6 weeks of dead air was starting to test his. Somewhere on that flight across the Atlantic, he had already started rehearsing what he would tell the people above him if this trip turned out to be a waste of a plane ticket. Marvin had spent those 6 weeks doing something nobody in the room understood yet. He wasn't avoiding the work. He was tearing apart everything he knew how to make in building something with no name. He had 2 drum machines that didn't talk to each other properly, a synthesizer he barely understood, and a sound in his head that didn't belong to Motown, didn't belong to the radio, didn't belong to anyone but him. Every night he locked himself in with the engineer and worked until the sun came up over the gray water outside, layering his own voice over itself 4, 5, 6 times, building harmonies out of nothing but patience and a stubbornness that had outlived almost everything else in his life. Larkin didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was a budget, a deadline, and a man who looked like he hadn't slept right in a decade. The engineer who'd been working with Marvin those 6 weeks would later say the strangest part wasn't the long hours. It was the silence between them. Marvin barely spoke while he worked. He would point at a fader, tap a rhythm on his knee until the engineer understood what he wanted, sing a harmony line once under his breath, and expect it remembered. There was no small talk, no joking around between takes the way there had been back in Detroit. It was as if Marvin had decided that every word he had left in him needed to go into the music, and nothing could be wasted on conversation. Some nights the engineer would fall asleep at the board and wake up to find Marvin still there, headphones on, eyes closed, listening back to the same 4 bars over and over until something about them finally felt true. "I need something I can play for the people upstairs," Larkin said. "Not a feeling, Marvin. A song." And here is where most men in Marvin's position would have folded, would have promised a single by Friday, would have apologized, would have offered some half-finished demo just to buy another week. Marvin did none of that. He simply nodded toward a chair like he was inviting an old friend to sit down for dinner, not like he was negotiating with the man who controlled whether this album would ever see daylight. There was a young writer in the room that week, a journalist who had come to interview Marvin and somehow never left, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with a notebook he wasn't using anymore. He reached into a bag and pulled out a cassette. Nobody in that room, not even Marvin, was entirely sure whose idea the song really was anymore. It had been built out of late-night conversations, half-jokes about needing healing of a very specific kind, scraps of melody hummed into a tape recorder at 3 in the morning. But it was real, and it was finished, and it was sitting on that cassette in the writer's hand like a loaded gun nobody had decided to fire yet. He held it out, not to Larkin, to Marvin. Marvin looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it, walked to the tape deck himself, and pressed play. What came out of those speakers wasn't anything Larkin Arnold had a category for. It wasn't Motown. It wasn't the protest music that had made Marvin's name a decade earlier. It wasn't even close to anything currently selling on American radio. It opened with a drum pattern that sounded mechanical and human at the same time, a heartbeat built out of circuitry, and then Marvin's voice came in low, patient, almost whispering, layered over itself in a way that made it sound like 4 men were singing the same secret at once. Larkin Arnold did not say a word for the length of the song. He had walked into that studio ready to write Marvin Gaye off as a liability, a name on a contract that was bleeding money with nothing to show for it. He had rehearsed somewhere over the ocean the exact tone he would use to tell the singer that patience in this business has a price, and that price had been paid in full. None of that came out of his mouth. He just stood there, in a room that smelled like cigarettes and rain, listening to a song that didn't yet have a name being played for him by the man who'd made it. When it ended, the only sound left was the hiss of the tape running out. "Play it again," Larkin said. That was all. 2 words. The executive who had crossed an ocean to demand an explanation didn't ask a single question about the 6 weeks of silence. He didn't ask why it took so long. He didn't ask what the budget overrun would cost. He sat in a folding chair in a damp Belgian studio and asked to hear it again, and then a third time, and by the third time, something in his face had changed from a man checking on an investment to a man who understood, quietly and completely, that he was listening to history before it had a release date. They called it sexual healing. It would go on to sell millions of copies, win Marvin his first 2 Grammy Awards, and become one of the most recognized bass lines in American music. But the part that never made it onto the record sleeve is the part that matters most. It's the image of a tired, broke, exiled man refusing to defend himself to the one person who held his career in his hands, choosing instead to simply let the work speak for him, and watching that work do something no argument ever could. Marvin never raised his voice that day in Austin. He didn't need to. There's a particular kind of power in a man who has been pushed to the edge of everything and still refuses to perform desperation for anyone, even the person who can end his career with a phone call. He let the silence sit. He let the executive squirm in it. And then instead of words, he gave him sound. And the sound did what Marvin himself couldn't always manage to do anymore, which was speak plainly and be understood. What's easy to forget, listening to that song on the radio decades later, smooth and confident and endlessly sampled, is that it was born out of a man who had nothing left to bargain with except his talent, standing in a borrowed room, facing down a man who held every card and simply choosing not to fold. He didn't win that meeting by convincing Larkin Arnold of anything. He won it by refusing to need to. In the weeks that followed, the song moved fast in a way nothing in Marvin's career had moved in years. Mixing sessions, mastering, the slow machinery of a major label finally turning in his favor instead of against him. Larkin went back to New York and told the people above him that the delay had been worth every dollar, that what he'd heard in that studio wasn't a problem to be managed, but a hit waiting to be released properly. The same executive who had crossed an ocean ready to pull the plug became, almost overnight, the song's loudest advocate inside the building. Nobody upstairs at Columbia argued with him for long. They didn't need to. They just had to listen. Within a year, Marvin Gaye would be standing on a stage accepting Grammy Awards for a song that almost didn't get made in a studio above a fish market in a country he never planned to live in. The executive who walked in ready to shut the whole project down would later credit that exact session, that exact silence, as the moment he understood exactly what kind of artist he was dealing with. Nobody in that room that night could have known how short the time left really was. Nobody could have known that the man who had just rebuilt his entire career out of nothing but stubbornness and a borrowed cassette tape had less than 2 years left to live. They only knew that something had shifted, that the balance of power in that small, smoke-filled room had quietly moved from the man with the checkbook to the man with the voice, and that it had happened without a single raised word.